In a town built on secrets, a starving boy was about to be whipped for stealing a single biscuit. The crowd watched, silent and grim. They were used to cruelty here. It was a currency, just like coin and corn. But the man who came to stop it, he wasn't the boy's father. He wasn't a lawman. He was something else entirely. And his arrival was about to unearth a sin this town had buried long ago. The wind in Dawson's Hollow didn't just blow, it clawed. It came down from the barren hills with a moaning sound, like it remembered every terrible thing that had ever happened there. It stirred up the dust, a fine red powder that coated everything, getting in your eyes, your throat, and your soul. On this day, the dust was thick in the town square, kicked up by the boots of men who had gathered for a bit of afternoon entertainment. The entertainment was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 8, maybe 9. He was all sharp angles and pale skin, with a mess of red hair that looked like a tangled bird's nest. Freckles were scattered across his face, and a single biscuit crumb clung to the corner of his mouth, a sad reminder of the crime. The rest of the biscuit was a greasy smear under the heavy boot of Sheriff Curtis Mott. The boy Sammy had snatched it from a basket outside Emmett Gaines's general store. Emmett stood there now, his face red and puffy, his hands balled into fists. "Thieving little rat," Emmett spat, the words curling in the dry air. "Ain't the first time, neither. He's a stray, and strays need to be taught a lesson." His voice was loud, playing to the crowd, making sure they all saw him as a man of principle, a man defending his property. But everyone knew Emmett was just a bully who liked to see the weak suffer. It made him feel big. Standing on the church steps, like a king on his throne, was the Reverend Amos Clay. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, who always looked like he was sucking on a lemon. His hands were folded neatly over his Bible, a gesture of piety that fooled no one. "Spare the rod, spoil the child," the Reverend intoned, his voice smooth and cold. It was a voice that could talk of hellfire and damnation while sounding like it was ordering a cup of tea. Let this be a lesson he remembers next time his belly growls louder than the word of God. The crowd murmured in agreement. It was easy to agree with the Reverend. It was safe. A man named Burke, one of Emmett's cronies, stepped forward, pulling a thick leather strap from his belt. He grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. He grabbed Sammy's thin arm and the boy flinched but didn't cry out. He'd learned long ago that crying just made it worse. Burke shoved him toward the hitching post, bending him over the worn wood. Sammy's knees trembled, but he locked them tight. He stared at the dirt, his face a blank mask. He was trying to go somewhere else in his mind, somewhere the strap couldn't reach him. No one moved to stop it. The people of Dawson's Hollow were spectators in their own lives, watching things happen because it was easier than getting involved. Sheriff Mott just stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on nothing. His eyes, which had once been sharp and clear, were now a dull, cloudy gray. They were the color of regret. He knew he should step in. He was the law, after all. But the law in this town was a tricky thing. It wasn't written in books. It was forged in the wills of men like the Reverend and Emmett Gaines. To go against them was to risk everything. So Mott did what he always did. Nothing. The strap whistled through the air. It came down once, hard across Sammy's back. A sharp, ugly sound, like a branch snapping. The boy's body jerked and a choked gasp escaped his lips. Again the strap rose and fell. A second time, then a third. Each crack of the leather seemed to echo off the silent, wooden faces of the buildings, a soundtrack for the town's indifference. The crowd was silent, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and shame. This was justice in Dawson's Hollow, swift, brutal, and public. Burke raised the strap for the fourth strike, a cruel smile on his face. He was enjoying this, but the strap never landed. A voice cut through the tense silence. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple, quiet statement, spoken with the weight of a mountain. "He is my son." For a long moment, nobody breathed. Every head in the square turned, slow and deliberate, toward the man who had spoken. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a figure who seemed to have materialized out of the dust and shadows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in a faded wool blanket, its patterns ancient and unfamiliar. His skin was the color of weathered bronze, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind and hardship. His black hair, streaked with gray, was braided down his back. He carried no gun, wore no badge. There was nothing about him that should have commanded such instant, absolute attention, except for his eyes. They were dark, steady, and unblinking, and in their depths something burned, something older than the town, older than the law, older than the dusty Bible in the Reverend's hands. Empt Gaines started to say something, a curse or a challenge, but the words withered in his throat. The stranger didn't seem to notice him. He walked forward, his worn boots making no sound on the packed earth. The crowd parted for him, a silent, fearful wave. He walked right up to the hitching post and stood between Sammy and the whip, his body a solid, immovable shield. He never once broke eye contact with the Reverend Amos Clay. Then he knelt. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man so large and imposing, he gathered the small, trembling boy into his arms. Sammy was as light as a bundle of twigs, limp with shock and pain, but his eyes flickered up, dazed and confused. "He is my son," the man repeated, his voice low and steady, like a river flowing over ancient stones. "And you will not touch him again." The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer passive, it was electric, charged with tension and disbelief. The townspeople looked at each other, then at the sheriff, waiting for someone to do something, to restore the familiar, ugly order of things. Sheriff Mott finally uncrossed his arms, his face a mask of unease. "Now hold on a minute, mister," he said, his voice raspy. "I don't reckon I've seen you around these parts before." The stranger looked at the sheriff then, and for the first time Mott felt the full force of that gaze. It felt like being weighed and measured. "My name is Elijah," the man said. "Elijah Black Elk." A gasp rippled through the back of the crowd. A cattleman leaned over to his friend, his eyes wide. "Black Elk? Ain't he one of the Lakota from up near Broken Pipe Reservation?" The other man nodded grimly. "Heard a story about him. They say he took on 6 bounty hunters by himself up north. Walked right through a crossfire like the bullets couldn't touch him." The legend was already taking shape, a whispered myth growing in the dusty square. But Reverend Clay was not a man to be intimidated by whispers. He stepped down from the church porch, his face a mask of cold fury. "You cannot claim what is not yours," he declared, his voice ringing with righteous authority. "This boy is no kin to you. He is a vagrant, a thief. I saw him with my own eyes." Elijah's gaze shifted back to the Reverend. His voice when he spoke was dangerously soft. "He was starving. He was hurt. He was alone. And not a single man in this town lifted a hand to help him. You only raised your hands to strike him." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and sharp. "That makes him mine." "By what right?" the Reverend challenged, his eyes blazing. Elijah looked down at the boy in his arms, then back at the preacher. And he said a word that was so foreign in Dawson's Hollow, it sounded like it came from another language. "Love." The word just hung there, awkward and out of place. It was a word for hymns and deathbeds, not for a public whipping. Someone in the crowd chuckled nervously, but it died out quickly. Empt Gaines muttered a curse and took a step back, suddenly wanting nothing to do with this. Sheriff Mott looked from Elijah to the Reverend, his face etched with conflict. I can't say what's legal here, Elijah," he finally managed to say. "The law gets tangled, but I can say you ought to just leave before someone gets a stupid idea." Elijah gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a sign of submission. It was an acknowledgement of a simple truth. Without another word, he turned. He held Sammy close, the boy's head resting against his chest. The crowd, which had been a solid wall of judgment just moments before, simply melted away, creating a path for him. No one met his eyes. As he walked away from the square, his back straight and proud, the Reverend's voice sliced through the air one last time. "You are leading that child into darkness. You are damning his soul." But the words had no power. They fell flat against the profound silence Elijah left behind. Old Joe Pickens, the blacksmith, who had been watching the whole affair from the shadows of his forge, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He watched Elijah disappear down the road, a tall, lonely figure carrying a broken child. Well, I'll be, Joe said to no one in particular. Looks like a real man finally walked into this town. But the story wasn't that simple, because Joe Pickens had seen Elijah before, years ago, and he knew that Elijah Black Elk hadn't come to Dawson's Hollow by chance. He had come for a reason, and it had nothing to do with a stolen biscuit. Elijah carried the boy away from the prying eyes of the town, his steps long and sure. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the valley, where a collection of withered cornfields gave way to a rusted wire fence. Just beyond it sat an old abandoned stable. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the gate hung crooked on a single hinge. But it was shelter. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of hay and dry earth. Sunlight streamed in through the gaps between the wooden slats, painting golden stripes on the dusty floor. Elijah gently laid Sammy down on a pile of clean hay, covering him with his own faded blanket. The boy was trembling, his body still clenched tight against the memory of the strap. His eyes, wide and fearful, darted toward the open doorway, as if expecting the mob to follow them. Elijah moved with a quiet efficiency. He went to the small creek that ran behind the stable and returned with a strip of cloth soaked in cold, clear water. He knelt beside Sammy and began to clean the angry red welts on his back. His hands were large and calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. Sammy flinched at first, but as Elijah worked, the boy's trembling slowly subsided. He didn't cry. He just watched, his gaze fixed on the man's hands, trying to understand what was happening. When the wounds were clean and wrapped with another strip of cloth, Elijah placed a small loaf of dark bread and a piece of dried meat beside the boy. He didn't urge him to eat. He just set it there, an offering. Then he went to the center of the stable and built a small fire, its crackle and pop filling the quiet space. He sat cross-legged, staring into the flames, his face as still and unreadable as a stone carving. The sun went down, and the sky outside the stable door filled with a brilliant spray of stars. An hour passed in total silence, broken only by the sound of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, Sammy's voice, small and raspy, broke the stillness. "Why'd you do it?" Elijah didn't turn his head. He seemed to be listening to something far away, something only he could hear. "I lost a son once," he said at last, his voice a low rumble. "A long time ago. He was small like you, just as stubborn, just as brave." He paused, the firelight flickering in his dark eyes. A fever took him, and the world went quiet for a very long time. The answer wasn't what Sammy had expected. He stared at the fire, processing this new piece of information. They said I ain't worth nothing," Sammy whispered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Said my mama was trash, and I'm worse. They lied." Elijah's words were simple, direct, and absolute. They weren't meant to be comforting. They were a statement of fact. And in that moment, Sammy believed him. Another long silence settled between them, but this one felt different. It was warm and safe. You really gonna keep me?" Sammy asked, his voice cracking on the last word. For the first time, Elijah turned and looked at him fully. His gaze was so intense it felt like it could see right through Sammy's skin, down to the scared, lonely heart beating in his chest. "If you want to be kept," he said. Sammy gave a single sharp nod, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. "My name's Sammy." "I know," Elijah said softly. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Sammy flinched, but he didn't pull away. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he wasn't alone. In the morning, he knew the whispers in town would start. They'd call Elijah a kidnapper, a savage. The Reverend would preach about him from the pulpit. Empt Gaines would spit his name like a curse. But none of that mattered in the quiet warmth of the old stable. Tonight, something had shifted. A seed of hope had been planted in the frozen ground of a little boy's heart. But back in town, another conversation was taking place. Sheriff Mott sat in his office, the door locked, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on his desk. Across from him sat Joe Pickens, the blacksmith. Joe's face was grim. "You know who he is, don't you, Curtis?" Joe asked quietly. The sheriff didn't look up. He just stared into his glass. "I know." "Then you know why he's really here. It ain't for the boy." Joe leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. He's here for what happened to the boy's mother. The sheriff's hand tightened around his glass. That was 10 years ago, Joe. It's over. Buried. Nothing's ever buried for good in this town, the blacksmith said, his eyes dark with memory. And a man like Elijah Black Elk, he's the kind of man who knows exactly where to dig. The sheriff finally looked up, and Joe could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't fear of Elijah. It was fear of the truth. Dawn crept into the stable like a shy visitor, its pale light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Sammy woke with a start, his body instantly tensing, preparing for a blow that didn't come. He sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs, and looked around. He was still there, in the stable. Safe. Elijah was sitting by the dying embers of the fire, using a small, sharp bone needle to mend a broken strap on an old saddlebag. He didn't look up, but he seemed to sense Sammy was awake. "You're safe," he said, his voice calm and even. "They won't find you here, and if they do, they won't touch you." Sammy relaxed just a little. He watched the man work, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. The silence stretched on, comfortable and easy. "Why you talk like that?" Sammy finally asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "Like you already know what I'm going to ask." Elijah finished a stitch before he answered. "Because I've heard those questions before," in another boy's voice. He still didn't look up, but Sammy felt the weight of those words. He felt the ghost of the other boy in the small, quiet space. "You talk less than anybody I ever met," Sammy observed. Elijah gave a slow nod. "Words don't keep the fire lit." That made a strange kind of sense to Sammy. He hugged his knees to his chest. "I don't got nobody," he said suddenly, the confession tumbling out of him. "I know," Elijah replied. My uncle. He used to lock me outside if I didn't sell enough of his stupid matches. Even in the winter." "I know that too." Sammy blinked. "How? How do you know that?" Elijah finally set down his work and looked at the boy. His eyes were filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "Because you have the look of someone who had to learn how to be invisible to survive. Someone who learned too early that making noise only brings more pain." The truth of it hit Sammy so hard he couldn't speak. He looked down at his own hands, at the dirt caked under his fingernails, at the bruises on his knuckles. This man didn't just see him, he understood him. Later that morning, Elijah led him down to the river. It ran cold and fast over smooth gray stones, its voice a constant, rushing whisper. Elijah handed Sammy a small rough bar of lye soap. "It'll sting at first," he said, already rolling up his own sleeves. "But it will wash away more than just the dirt." Sammy hesitated at the water's edge. It looked impossibly cold. He was used to being dirty. Dirt was like a second skin, a layer of protection. But he looked at Elijah, at his calm, patient face, and took a deep breath. With a shiver, he stepped into the biting current. The cold was a shock, a physical blow that stole his breath, but he didn't make a sound. When he finally stumbled out, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, Elijah was there with a dry wool cloth. He wrapped it around Sammy's thin shoulders and handed him a clean, worn shirt. It was far too big, hanging on him like a sack, but it was clean. The feeling was so new, so strange, that Sammy couldn't stop looking down at himself, as if he were seeing a different boy entirely. They spent the rest of the day in the woods. Elijah was a silent teacher. He didn't use many words. He showed. He showed Sammy how to read the signs of the forest, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of leaves, the direction of the wind. He showed him how to set a snare so perfectly that it seemed like a natural part of the landscape. When a plump rabbit later fell into the trap, Sammy gasped in amazement. "You really caught it, just like that." Elijah knelt beside the animal, his movements quick and respectful. "The woods will provide," he said quietly, "if you learn how to listen to what it's telling you. If you move like you belong here, the world won't even notice you're taking what you need." Sammy stared at the rabbit, then up at Elijah, a new kind of light in his eyes. You think I could ever learn to do that?" "You already have," Elijah said. "You've been learning how to be invisible your whole life. Now you just need to learn how to use it." That night, as a soft rain began to patter on the stable roof, Sammy felt something shift inside him. He reached into the pocket of his tattered trousers and pulled out a small tarnished brass button. "My mama," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She had this real fine coat, blue like the flowers that grow by the creek. This was from it." He held it out to Elijah. Elijah took the button, his large fingers surprisingly delicate. He turned it over, studying its worn surface. "You keep it for luck," he said, handing it back. Sammy shook his head, clutching the button tight in his fist. "Nah, I keep it 'cause she's the only one who ever touched me without it hurting." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. "Then it's more than luck," he said. "It's memory, and memory is a powerful weapon." Meanwhile, the whispers in town had turned into a low roar. Old Joe Pickens had told the story at the saloon, and it had spread like wildfire. "He just walked in there and claimed the boy," Joe had said, his voice full of awe. "Said, 'He's my son.' And hell if you didn't believe him when you saw them together." Harlan, the innkeeper, scoffed. "You actually believe that nonsense, Joe? That boy ain't no more his kin than I am. He's a redskin and the boy's a freckle-faced stray." "Doesn't have to be blood to be family, Harlan," Joe had shot back. "Sometimes choice is a damn sight stronger." The next morning, the town's fear and prejudice began to show its teeth. When Elijah and Sammy walked past the general store, EMT Gaines slammed his door shut with a loud bang. "We don't want your kind here," he yelled through the wood. "Not beggars and not savages." Sammy flinched, his small hands curling into fists. But Elijah placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder that some battles were won with silence. Reverend Clay, however, was not a man who believed in silence. His sermon that Sunday was a masterpiece of fire and fury. He didn't mention Elijah by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. "There are wolves in our midst," he thundered from the pulpit, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Wolves in sheep's clothing, who come to steal our children, to lead them into the darkness of their heathen ways. A child taken from the light of civilization, corrupted by a hand painted in war." Sheriff Mott sat in the back pew, as he always did, his face a stony mask. But the Reverend's words tasted like ash in his mouth. After the service, he went back to his office. He unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out an old dusty file. The name on the tab was faded but still legible. Lily Dean. He opened it. Inside was a single yellowed piece of paper. A death certificate. It said she died of a fever 10 years ago. It was signed by the town doctor, who had himself died 5 years back. At the bottom of the page, in the space for next of kin, was a single, chilling word. None. But Sheriff Mott knew that was a lie. He had been there the night Lily died, and he knew she hadn't been alone, and she hadn't died from any fever. The Reverend's sermon wasn't about saving a boy's soul. It was about making sure a ghost stayed buried. The air grew colder. Autumn was settling over Dawson's Hollow, painting the leaves in shades of rust and blood. Sammy's cough, which had started as a small tickle, had deepened into a raw, chesty bark that shook his small frame. Elijah knew he needed proper medicine, not just the herbal teas he'd been brewing. The thought of returning to town settled in his gut like a cold stone, but he had no choice. As they walked toward the square, the change in the town was palpable. People didn't just whisper anymore. They stared, openly, hostilely. It was as if Sammy's healing, his quiet defiance in the face of their judgment, was a personal insult to them all. Harlan the innkeeper stood on his porch, wiping his hands on a dirty rag, and pointedly turned his back as they passed. Even old Joe Pickens, who had once spoken of them with a grudging respect, now just nodded curtly from his forge, his eyes avoiding theirs. The town had closed ranks. It had decided that Elijah and Sammy were a sickness to be purged. Inside the apothecary, a nervous young clerk fumbled with the bottle of cough syrup, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "The 3 cents, he stammered, not meeting Elijah's eyes. Elijah placed the coins on the counter. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken threats. As they turned to leave, a large figure blocked the doorway. It was Emmett Gaines, his face twisted into a permanent sneer. "You really think you can just keep waltzing in here?" Emmett growled, his voice a low rumble of menace. Parading that little thief around like some kind of prize? We don't want you here. We don't want him here. Sammy froze, his small body rigid with a mixture of fear and fury. He wanted to shout, to scream, to tell this man that he wasn't a thief, that he had a name. But the words wouldn't come. He was still the invisible boy, the boy who knew that making noise only brought more pain. Elijah said nothing. He simply stood there, a silent, unmovable mountain. His stillness was more powerful than any threat Emmett could muster. "Let them pass, Emmett." The voice came from the alleyway. Sheriff Mott stepped out into the light, his arms crossed, his face grim. He didn't look at Elijah or Sammy. He kept his eyes fixed on the shopkeeper. MTD snorted in disgust, but, after a tense moment, stepped aside. "This ain't over, Sheriff," he muttered as they walked past. "There's a right way of things, and this ain't it." Mott didn't reply. As Elijah and Sammy passed him, the boy glanced up, his eyes meeting the sheriff's for a brief, fleeting moment. It wasn't a look of gratitude. It was a question. And Mott knew with a sinking feeling in his gut that he didn't have the answer to it. Back in the relative safety of the stable, Sammy sat by the fire, silently sipping the sweet, sticky medicine. Beside him on a piece of hay sat the small, rough horse Elijah had carved for him. Its legs were a little crooked, and its mane was uneven, but Sammy treasured it. He carried it everywhere, its worn wooden form a constant, solid presence in his pocket, next to his mother's button. "Why do they hate you so much?" Sammy asked quietly, his voice raspy from the cough. Elijah was tending to the fire, carefully adding small sticks to the flames. "They don't hate me," he said, his back still to the boy. "Not really." He turned, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "They hate what I remind them of." "What's that?" Sammy asked. "That they're not the men they pretend to be on Sundays." Sammy considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It was an old man's nod, full of a wisdom no child should possess. That night the church bell rang, not for a service, but for a meeting. The Reverend had summoned the town's most influential men, Eamt, Harlan, and a handful of others. They gathered in the church hall, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on their grim faces. "It is not our way," the Reverend began, his voice low and urgent, "to allow a child of this community to be raised outside the law, outside the Word of God. This outsider has filled the boy's head with his godless rituals and his silence. He is turning the boy against us, against everything that is decent and right. I say it must end. Tonight." The men murmured in agreement, their fear and prejudice stoked into a righteous flame by the Reverend's words. After the meeting, Clay caught up with Sheriff Mott outside, beneath the skeletal branches of the old hanging tree. "You have a duty here, Curtis," the Reverend said, his voice sharp. "This is no longer about a stolen biscuit. It's about the law. That child belongs in an orphanage, where he can be given a proper name and a Christian education." Mott stared up at the frayed rope that still swung from the tree's thickest limb. "You ever notice how quiet that boy is, Reverend?" he asked, his voice strangely distant. The Reverend frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I think," Mott said, turning to face him, his gray eyes hard as stone, "that it has everything to do with it. I think he's quiet because he's learned that the loudest men in this town are usually the cruelest." The Reverend's eyes narrowed into slits. "You're letting your sentiment cloud your judgment. What happens when that boy grows up wild? What if he becomes just like him?" Sheriff Mott allowed a small, bitter smile to touch his lips. "Then he'd probably be the best damn man in this whole sorry town," he said, and turned and walked away into the darkness. The next day it happened. Elijah saw the dust trail first, a rising plume of red against the blue sky. 3 riders heading straight for the stable. He didn't need to be told who they were. He stepped outside the stable door, his face calm, and waited. Sammy stood just behind him, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He could feel the familiar, cold terror creeping up his spine, but he fought it down. He would not be invisible today. The men reined in their horses a few yards away. It was Emmet, Burke, and another ranch hand Sammy didn't recognize. They dismounted slowly, their hands hovering near the pistols at their hips. "We've come for the boy," Emmett said, his voice flat and hard. "The Reverend sent us. Says he belongs in a home." "He has a home," Elijah replied, his voice just as steady. "He ain't yours," Burke snarled. "He is now." The men started to close in, their faces set in grim lines. The air crackled with the promise of violence. Sammy felt a tremor run through his body, but then he did something that surprised even himself. He stepped forward, out from behind Elijah's protective shadow. "He's my father," Sammy said, his voice small and thin, but clear and unwavering. It was the first time the word had ever crossed his lips. "And I ain't going with you." MT let out a harsh laugh. "That ain't how this works, kid. You don't get a choice." "It is now," a new voice said, a voice that cracked like a whip. Everyone turned. Sheriff Mott was standing at the edge of the clearing, a shotgun resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. His eyes were cold and hard. "Go home, MT," the sheriff said. "This is over." MT stared at him, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. You're protecting him? A savage over your own people?" "I'm protecting a child from a bunch of bullies who are about to do something they'll regret," Mott corrected him. "Now I'm only going to say it one more time. Go home." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly Emmett and his men backed away. They mounted their horses and rode off without another word, their anger a palpable wave in the air behind them. The sheriff watched them go, then turned to Elijah. His face was weary. "This bought you some time, that's all. The Reverend's not going to stop. He'll write to the state, get a judge involved. You'll need papers. Something official that says the boy's yours." Elijah just nodded once. "I'll help you," Mott said, surprising himself as much as Elijah. "I'll draft the papers, but it won't be easy to make them stick." "Nothing worth keeping ever is," Elijah replied. That night, Sammy didn't need his cough syrup. He sat by the fire, the wooden horse clutched in one hand, his mother's button in the other. He felt different, stronger. "Back there," he said, his eyes on the flames. "When they came for me, I thought I'd be scared." "You were scared," Elijah said gently, "but you stood anyway. That's called courage." Sammy looked up, a small tentative smile touching his lips for the first time. It feels like I'm not just running anymore." "You're not," Elijah confirmed. "Feels like I'm starting something." "You are." Sammy leaned back, a newfound confidence in his posture. "Reckon we'll ever leave this place, Elijah?" he asked. Elijah looked up at the darkened rafters, as if he could see the stars through them. "One day," he said. "Where will we go?" "Somewhere the world is wide," Elijah murmured, "and men carry more questions in their hearts than judgments." Sammy chuckled softly. "Is that a real place?" Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was a promise. But in town, the Reverend Amos Clay was in his study, his face illuminated by the angry glow of an oil lamp. He was scribbling furiously on a piece of parchment. It was a letter to a circuit judge he knew, a man who shared his rigid, unforgiving view of the world. The letter was full of lies and half-truths, painting Elijah as a violent, heathen kidnapper and Sammy as a child in mortal peril. The Reverend knew he had lost the battle today, but he was a patient man. He would win the war. He would see that boy ripped from the savage's arms, and he would see Elijah Black Elk driven out of his town or put in the ground. Because what the sheriff didn't know, what no one knew, was that the Reverend's obsession with the boy had nothing to do with God or the law. It had everything to do with the secret he and Lily Dean had shared. The secret that was buried in an unmarked grave just behind the church. The first hard frost arrived overnight, a silent thief that stole the last of the autumn color and left the world brittle and gray. The grass in the valley crackled underfoot, each blade a tiny shard of glass. Winter was coming, and it carried the scent of an ending. Inside the stable, a small fire pushed back against the encroaching cold. Sammy was sleeping, curled up beneath a mound of blankets, his breathing deep and even for the first time in weeks. The guardianship papers Sheriff Mott had drafted were tucked safely inside Elijah's coat. They were a flimsy shield against the storm that was gathering, but they were something. He knew it wouldn't be enough. Men like the Reverend didn't respect paper. They only respected power. And Elijah knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the frost, that the Reverend was coming. The sound of hoofbeats reached him just after noon. 3 riders moving with a grim, determined purpose that hadn't been there before. Elijah stepped out of the stable, his eyes scanning the ridge. The Reverend was in the lead, his face a pale, tight mask of fury. He wasn't wearing his preacher's robes today. He was dressed for a different kind of business. Beside him rode Mt. Gaines and the man named Burke, their faces set and hard. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was an execution. Sheriff Mott stood on the boardwalk of the main street as they rode past. He watched them go, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. But he didn't move. His face was a study in conflict, a man caught between his badge and his conscience. He had given Elijah the papers, but he knew they were meaningless now. He had chosen his side, and he knew, with a terrible, sinking finality, that he had chosen wrong. Sammy woke to the sound of the horses. He sat up, his eyes wide with fear. "They're here," he whispered. Elijah stepped back inside the stable. He looked at the boy, at the terror on his face, and his own expression hardened, becoming something ancient and implacable. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and calm. "No," Sammy said, scrambling to his feet. "I'm with you." He stood beside Elijah, a small, defiant shadow against the larger man. His fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was there too. Resolve. He would not be invisible. Not today. The riders reined in their horses, kicking up a spray of frozen mud. The Reverend dismounted, a piece of paper clutched in his gloved hand. It was an official warrant, signed by a state judge. It gave him the authority to take custody of one Samuel Dean, a minor, and remove him from the unlawful and dangerous influence of a man known as Elijah Black Elk. "It's over, heathen," the Reverend called out, his voice sharp and triumphant. "You have defied the law of man and the law of God. The boy comes with me now." Elijah stepped forward, placing himself squarely in front of Sammy. "You bring a piece of paper to do your dirty work, preacher?" The Reverend's face flushed with anger. "I bring order. I am saving this boy from a life of savagery and sin. You have filled his head with lies and turned him against his own people." "I gave him food when you let him starve," Elijah countered, his voice like stones grinding together. "I gave him a home when you turned him out. I gave him my name when you called him trash." "You gave him nothing but corruption," Clay shrieked, his composure finally cracking. It was then that Sammy found his voice. It rose from deep within him, clear and strong, cutting through the cold air. "He's lying," Sammy shouted, stepping out from behind Elijah. He pointed a trembling finger at the Reverend. "You hit me. I saw you. The night the night she died. You were there. You hit her, too." The world seemed to stop. Mt. and Burke stared at the boy, then at the Reverend, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. The Reverend's face went completely white. "The boy is delirious," he stammered. "He's sick. He doesn't know what he's saying." "I know what I saw," Sammy insisted, tears of rage and grief streaming down his face. "She wasn't sick. You were fighting and she fell. She hit her head on the hearth. You killed her." The ugly secret was finally out, spoken into the cold, clear air for all to hear. Lily Dean hadn't died of a fever. She had died at the hands of the Reverend. And the Reverend's obsession with Sammy wasn't about saving his soul. It was about silencing the only witness to his crime. "Lies!" the Reverend screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. He pulled a small pistol from beneath his coat. "The boy is a font of corruption. He must be cleansed." He raised the gun, his hands shaking, and aimed it directly at Sammy. Everything happened at once. Elijah moved not with speed, but with an unstoppable physical force, a blur of motion that put him directly in the path of the bullet. At the same instant, a rifle shot cracked through the air, but it didn't come from the clearing. It came from the trees. Burke, the man with the yellow teeth and the leather strap, grunted and fell to the ground, his own rifle clattering beside him. Mt. Gaines stared in disbelief. Then his eyes went wide with terror as he saw the figure stepping out from the woods. It was Sheriff Mott. His face was pale, but his eyes were blazing with a fire no one had ever seen there before. He held a smoking rifle in his hands. "Drop the gun, Amos," the sheriff said, his voice deadly calm. "It's over." The Reverend stared at him, his mind reeling. You betrayed your own town. You betrayed the law." "No," Mott said, taking a step forward. "I'm finally upholding it." He looked past the Reverend, his eyes finding Sammy. "I was there too that night, kid. I was just a deputy then. The Reverend, he told me she tripped, that it was an accident. He said it was for the best, that no one would want a child born of sin." The sheriff's voice broke. "I was a coward. I let him bury the truth. I let him bury your mother. I've lived with that every day since." The Reverend, seeing his world crumbling around him, let out a desperate animal cry and turned his gun on the sheriff. But he never got the shot off. Elijah was on him in a heartbeat. He didn't hit him. He didn't need to. He simply took the gun from the Reverend's hand as if taking a toy from a child. He grabbed the front of the preacher's coat and lifted him effortlessly off the ground, his face inches from Clay's. "You raise a gun to a child," Elijah whispered, his voice a sound of pure, cold fury. "You had better be ready to bury your own soul." He then dropped the Reverend into a crumpled, sobbing heap on the frozen ground. Emmett Gaines, seeing the whole ugly truth laid bare, slowly raised his hands in the air and dropped his own gun belt. He looked at Sammy, at the tears on the boy's face, and for the first time, a look of genuine shame crossed his features. The town of Dawson's Hollow was built on a lie, and the lie had just been torn down. The law came for the Reverend Clay. State marshals took him away in irons, his righteous fury replaced by a pathetic, whimpering fear. Burke survived, but with a permanent limp and a new, healthy fear of the town sheriff. EMTT Gaines gave his testimony and then quietly sold his store and moved away, unable to face the town he had helped terrorize. Sheriff Mott offered Sammy everything: the church property, the Reverend's house, a formal adoption. He wanted to atone, to make things right. But Sammy just shook his head. He had a home. He had a father. A few weeks later, when the first snows of winter began to fall, two figures left Dawson's Hollow: a tall, silent man and a small, red-haired boy. They walked side by side, their shoulders almost touching. They didn't look back. They were headed somewhere the world was wide, somewhere a man's worth wasn't measured by the color of his skin or the God he prayed to, but by the kindness in his heart. They were headed toward a place where a boy who had been called worthless could finally, truly belong. The story of Elijah and Sammy became a legend in that valley. They say that Sheriff Mott became the best lawman the territory had ever seen, a man who valued justice over rules. They say the town itself changed, that the people learned to look out for one another, to never again stand by and watch while cruelty was done. They learned that sometimes the most important laws aren't written in any book. Sometimes the only law that matters is the one that tells you to stand up for a child who has no one else. It's the law that tells you to be the stranger who walks out of the dust and says, "He is mine." If you've ever felt lost or invisible, or been told you're not worth anything, remember Sammy. Remember that even in the darkest, cruelest places, a single act of courage can change everything. And if you're lucky enough to be strong, be the Elijah in someone else's story. Be the one who stands up, who speaks out, and who offers a hand to someone who has fallen. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. And let me know in the comments below. What do you think is stronger, the law of the land or the law of the heart? Until next time, stay safe out there.